Welcome back to the Drunk on Writing Tarantino Dissections, brought to you in part through the patronage of Ariya Norinth. And guess what? After looking at his roots, after looking at his so-called first film and all of his little Hollywood breaks, we're finally delving into Quentin Tarantino's true directorial debut, 1992's stage play-esque crime drama, Reservoir Dogs. And I've got to say, though I've seen this movie dozens of times, I just rewatched it for this series and for this dissection, of course, and I gotta say, it's a great movie. It's so good. It's still very much an independent film, don't get me wrong, but there is just something about this movie that's just absolutely fantastic. I personally love it, which is probably why I wanted to do this series. But before we get into all of that, remember, if you'd like to see more of this, be sure to subscribe to the channel, like the video, give it a thumbs up, leave a comment below, and head on over to drunkonwriting.com and sign up to get more episodes more often, just like Tara Matheny and Cinephiliac did this past month. The brand new patrons, welcome to the Drunk on Writing Club, I guess, and, thank you for your support. It's very much appreciated. Now, while it didn't have as broad of an influence and doesn't necessarily hold the same sort of weight as Tarantino's immediate follow-up, Pulp Fiction, when it debuted in 1992 at the Sundance Film Festival, it almost immediately became the most talked about film at the festival. And though Tarantino wasn't exactly rolling in the dough once it went wide, I think it made about $2.8 million in the box office, and I read somewhere that Tarantino only made about $50,000 off of it, which is, really? Wow. But eventually, it'd be named one of the greatest independent films of all time by Empire magazine. Not bad for a film initially written in just 3.5 weeks, and which contains 272 F-bombs, and more than a handful of N-bombs, unfortunately. We're going to talk about that more in Pulp Fiction, because I think it's a bit more prominent there, and especially later on in things like Jackie Brown and Django Unchained. But we'll get there. Though Tarantino didn't just write this in a vacuum. He took his screenplay to a Sundance Institute Screenplay Workshop in June 1991, where he directed a few key scenes. You can actually watch these in full online in a couple versions of the DVD and the Blu-ray. And if you have seen them, you'll realize that Tarantino got some much-needed advice on how to actually build a film and put it together and film it and write it and get the most out of the actors from legendary writer and director Terry Gilliam. According to Tarantino, who recounted this advice much later, Gilliam told him, "As a director, you don't have to worry about bringing it to the big screen. Your job is to hire talented people who can do that. You hire a cinematographer who can get the kind of quality that you want. You have a talented costume designer who can give the colors that you need and the flamboyance or not that you want. You hire a production designer who can do that. Your job is explaining your vision. Your job is articulating to them what you want on the screen." Of course, if Tarantino had tried to film this on the cheap, as he did with My Best Friend's Birthday, and which, accordingly, he was all set to do, with the money from selling the True Romance script, who knows if, like My Best Friend's Birthday, Reservoir Dogs would have even ever been finished, let alone screened. But Tarantino, he sort of lucked out. Lawrence Bender, who he'd met at a barbecue a few years earlier, and who would have been part of the on-the-cheap production, showed the Reservoir Dogs script to his acting coach, whose wife was friends with Harvey Keitel. And Keitel liked what he read enough to come on as co-producer. That, coupled with buy-in from Monty Hellman and Richard N. Gladstein as executive producers, helped Tarantino bring up the budget to a cool $1.2 to $1.5 million or so. And to boot, Harvey Keitel paid for the New York casting sessions. How great is that? And remember, as part of the From Dusk Till Dawn deal that we mentioned last time, Robert Kurtzman's K&B Effects group was on board to help with some key special effects. Probably really the only special effects in the movie, I think, outside of some gunshots. So, anyways, he was in good shape, Tarantino. Even though, that's really not a lot to hang a full production on. So, for instance, while it meant they could keep a paramedic on set to ensure Mr. Orange's blood loss was realistic enough, and since they were filming in LA in July and August, that Tim Roth wouldn't be stuck to the floor too badly, they could do that, but they couldn't even afford traffic control. So when Mr. Pink, Steve Buscemi, when he drives off to escape the failed heist, they could only film that when the traffic lights were in their favor. And by the way, the way the cops completely miss the rear windshield here when that scene plays out, despite being literal steps behind the car, also pretty telling about the budget. Now, much of the reason for Reservoir Dogs' success, I'd say, other than Sally Menke's phenomenal editing job. She'd go on editing Tarantino's films through Inglourious Basterds, which is, for me, probably around the same time quality took a bit of a dip, but that's a story for another day. But that success comes, I think, especially because Reservoir Dogs continued to pick up steam long after it was released, largely in part thanks to great word of mouth. I think it comes from the fact that Reservoir Dogs just establishes everything that Tarantino's later films, especially Pulp Fiction, again, his very next one, everything that they hang their hat on. And not just the violence, the quippy dialogue, the pop culture references, and the often just egregious swears, but the non-linear plot, the explorative camera angles, the eclectic soundtrack, a simply unreal ensemble cast, and all those tiny little details only someone with OCD would probably drop in. Like Mr. Orange grabbing the wedding ring, Mr. Pink running out of coffee, the cops eating donuts.
You want one of these?
Yeah, give me the bear claw.
The note they aren't real people.
Did you kill anybody?
A few cops.
No real people?
Just cops.
It's all here in all its glory, though if you've been following along with this series, you'll know that all of these staples have been prominent through his screenplays. Everything that he's done so far, True Romance, From Dusk Till Dawn, everything that he's written, it has had these staples, right? And before we dig into that Madonna speech, the often superb choice in camera shots, or what Mr. White could have possibly whispered to the bloodied Mr. Orange to make him laugh, we have to look at Reservoir Dogs' influences, because calling them influences might be a little nice to Tarantino, because frankly, he just straight up lifted some of it. I steal from every single movie ever made. Empire quoted Tarantino saying back in 1994, "I love it. If my work has anything, it's that I'm taking this from this and that from that and mixing them all together. I steal from everything. Great artists steal. They don't do homages." It's a perfect quote to kind of summarize what Tarantino has been able to do with this knowledge, with this database that he built up, not just at Video Archives, where he worked, which is also, by the way, where the Reservoir Dogs title comes from. A customer mispronouncing Louis Malle's Au revoir les enfants. Though Tarantino's frequent collaborator Roger Avery remembers it as Tarantino mispronouncing it, and Tarantino's also kind of put an alternate kind of theory to it, that it was a reference to a production company's slush pile. So he said that in other interviews, so who the heck knows where the title actually came from. Also, sidebar, yes, I did look up how to pronounce that title, because I would have pronounced it really differently, and maybe would have also inspired somebody to make a title, so I didn't really want to do it. But with all of that knowledge that he built up as a straight cinephile, Reservoir Dogs has thefts aplenty. If you want to look at the film as a whole, we can look back at 1950s The Asphalt Jungle, 1952's Kansas City Confidential, and especially Stanley Kubrick's 1956 film. By the way, did you know Stanley Kubrick was making films back in 1956? I mean, it just seems like such another era, and it's really cool and makes sense now why he was considered so prolific. I only really know him from his 70s work, I guess his 90s as well. But no wonder people want me to cover him, which I probably will. But anyways, yes, his 1956 film, The Killing. You can look at all of these as influences, as inspirations for Reservoir Dogs. All of these have heists that, of course, go awfully awry. Kansas City and The Killing have different levels of anonymity among the thieves. And with The Killing, also some early non-linearity in the plot. Tarantino actually commented on that last one. He said, "I didn't go out of my way to do a ripoff of The Killing, But I did think of it, as in Reservoir Dogs, as my killing, my take on that kind of heist movie. Well, if you're gonna make a heist movie, I guess it makes sense to look at other giants within the field, right? Though it's too bad Tarantino couldn't drop in a Rodney Dangerfield cameo to make it a true full-on homage. Yes, Rodney Dangerfield appeared in The Killing. How cool is that? He was an extra in the background. It was awesome. Tarantino also borrows from The Taking of Pelham 123, which introduced the idea of color code names.
All right, Mr. Gray. Smooth as silk, Mr. Blue.
Though Mr. Pink seems to have been a Tarantino original, and just bless him for that. Did you know, by the way, that Pink, the pop singer, took her name from this? How cool is that? The torture scene has its roots in 1955's The Big Combo, which has a rather different, but still rather unpleasant focus on a cop's ear, though the camera work, the way we pan away, that's likely inspired by the way Alfred Hitchcock cuts from the brutality in Psycho's infamous shower scene. Tarantino also took the line, "Let's go to work," from 1966's The Professionals, reportedly one of his favorite films of all time, and trunk shots, largely attributed to Tarantino for making them popular again, well, they've been around since at least 1948's He Walked by Night. Those are all pretty minor and, yes, homages. We call them thefts, homages, whatever you want to call them. But there's one rather egregious lift, and that's Ringo Lam's 1987 film City on Fire, a crime thriller starring Chow Yun-fat, who gets a shout-out dedication in Tarantino's Reservoir Dogs script, mind you. High level, it's about an undercover cop who infiltrates a gang of jewelry thieves. Sound familiar? But in terms, if it was just that, if it was just a very similar plot, even if it was the same plot, that's one thing. That's the kind of plot that, you would find in however many novels. Sherlock Holmes probably did something similar back in the day. But I watched this recently. You can watch it in full on YouTube right now. And while I was watching it, it was enjoyable. It was a fun little movie. I didn't think much of it until about the last 15 to 20 minutes or so of Lamb's film, when we get the following. 1. The theft goes awry when someone shoots one of the clerks. 2. The cops chase the thieves, resulting in a car crash. 3. Defending themselves from the police, one thief just simply eradicates a few cops with double-fisted handguns. 4. After which, unfortunately, the undercover cop gets shot in the gut. 5. And, after reactively protecting himself, has a lingering, regretful stare down the barrel of the gun. It's these particulars that I find just bothersome. Almost shot for shot, right? And maybe you could write these off as tropes, but as they say, wait, there's more. 6. When they all get back to the hideout, the boss figures out not just that there's an undercover cop, but who it is. 7. One of the thieves then vouches for the undercover cop. 8. And then defends him to the death in a shootout. Though the way Mr. White uses Mr. Orange getting gut shot as an excuse that he can't be the undercover cop always kind of struck me as odd, because he didn't get shot by the police. I really don't understand that argument. But finally, point number 9, only to find out, yes, indeed, the undercover cop admits that he is a cop. Nearly beat for beat, Tarantino took City on Fire, at least the final act of it, and made it his own, including that seemingly unnecessary end-of-the-line confession. I always kind of question that, though Tarantino has said, when asked about that, he says, if you think it's unnecessary, you don't really get the movie. And all of that is on top of little things, like Mr. White's narrative about a reluctant manager being very similar to what goes down in City's heist, and just the way Chow Yun-fat runs, being so, how is this possible that it is this similar to how we follow Mr. Pink leaving the heist? I guess it's, only fitting that with Tarantino basically just taking City on Fire and recreating it for American audiences, that Reservoir Dogs would get the exact same treatment, right? And in 2002, director Sanjay Gupta did just that with Conte, which has this elevator pitch. 6 men meet in a lockup, where they've been wrongfully detained. Seeking revenge, they make the perfect plan to rob the very bank where police officers' salaries are deposited. The poster also adds, 6 honest intentions, 1 perfect betrayal. Again, making a heist movie, gotta check those giants, see what they did, and find out what works. I should note here, this isn't the last time that Tarantino will borrow from another film. As that quote I read earlier kind of implied, his entire catalog is built on this idea of harnessing the best of other films, taking these ideas that he identifies and says, oh, I like that, and just bringing it into his own film, making something new, something classic. And I think he did that here with Reservoir Dogs. You can kind of almost feel that, right? Right from that opening scene, right from that opening diner scene. I mean, even if it was added last minute just to give Mr. Blues some lines and maybe possibly foreshadow some of the relationships and fates, the pan around the gang, those little back and forths that they have, especially the bits about Toby.
Toby Wong. Toby Wong.
And whether you should tip a waitress or not, all framed by just an absolutely absurd dissection of Madonna's like a virgin. I mean, it's nearly bloody perfect. And after seeing the film, and this is a fun note, Madonna actually sent Tarantino a copy of her album, her 1992 album, Erotica, complete with a note that read, "To Quentin, it's not about dick, it's about love." Signed, Madonna. And though she's yet to work with him directly, she did appear in another segment of the 1995 anthology film 4 Rooms, which Tarantino chipped in on. We'll talk that more in a video down the line. Now, the diner, even if it is weird and kind of, it's rather conspicuous, don't you think, that they're all being out there, they're all kind of a bit loud, a bit boisterous, and Tarantino's talking about Madonna, dick. They're doing this right out in public, all wearing matching suits, right before they rob a jewelry store. You would think somebody would say that maybe this isn't a good idea. Maybe we go to the hideout and have some breakfast there, have some coffee, bring some Starbucks to the hideout and hang out. But despite all that, it is a great setup that makes every single one of the characters in this film almost instantly endearing. Even if Tarantino, who at this time still very much wanted to be an actor, and so yet again cast himself in a pretty starring role that gives him, of course, the opening line of the film. He actually originally wanted to play Mr. Pink, and I'm so grateful that didn't happen. He has some pretty noticeable difficulty meeting any of the other actors' eyes while going through his spiel. Have you noticed that? I noticed that in this last watch through, and I was just like, it doesn't hold the bar to the rest of them. But this whole thing, all the way through to the slow-mo walkout, to the George Baker selection's little green bag that follows. What an introduction. I mean, it makes us look at these guys that, they're cool, they're clever, they're professionals. So, when, just a few minutes later, as the opening credits are still rolling and we find out that something went very much not according to plan at this heist that happens completely off screen, it's astounding. Surprising, even. Now, I gotta admit, I'm a little torn on the heist being completely omitted from the film. But at the end of the day, I think it was the right call to do, especially after reading this quote from Tarantino where he admits, at one point, the reason for not showing the heist might have been budgetary, but I always liked the idea of never seeing it, and I kept that. For the first half, you wonder if you'll ever see the heist. In the second half, you realize the movie is about other things. Now, I don't think it takes getting to the second half for you to realize that Reservoir Dogs is not at all about the heist and really is about the downfall of the crew, because, especially once we get back to the rendezvous point, an abandoned mortuary, by the way, which helps explain the hearse you see Mr. Blonde sitting on later, and we start to get these little character moments that truly drive the heart of the film. First, between Mr. Orange and Mr. White, as he's trying to keep him calm, sedate. I don't know what he whispers to Mr. Orange, by the way, to make him laugh. But the Italian dubbed version puts it as, "Do you want me to give you a hand job too?" That seems about right for Tarantino's script. Then we get the awesome back and forth between Mr. White and Mr. Pink, chock full of just awesome camera angles and just personality setting zoom ins and zoom outs. I just, great camera work here all around. Actually, there's a part here I never caught until somebody pointed it out to me. I don't know if you saw it, but when they're in the washroom, or maybe it's where embalming is usually done, I don't know, those pink, white, and orange bottles in the back, that yellow sink on the left, they kind of hint at our characters' fates, don't they? maybe insinuate that Mr. Blonde and Mr. Orange, they're kind of working their own angles. They're not with the rest of the group necessarily. And that's kind of truly the case. And even if that's not the actual meaning behind it, I mean, the way that the camera lingers, that placement's got to be intentional, right? I mean, it just has to be. But Mr. Blonde, he comes in with his great barking dogs line, and at that point, just everything just seems to go to hell, doesn't it? This is the point in the film where we're getting the close-ups and we're getting great speeches, and Steve Buscemi and Harvey Keitel and Michael Madsen are just killing it. That I realized, especially in light of those early Sundance mock-ups, that this movie probably wouldn't work with a different cast. I mean, everybody here is at the top of their game. Well, maybe we'll ignore the self-cast Tarantino. Let's just take him out of the running because he's certainly not. But everybody else, I mean, it's just simply fantastic. I mean, it helps explain why Tarantino would go on to make several of them regulars for his future films. Now, a few of them I've already mentioned, namely Keitel as Mr. White, Buscemi as Mr. Pink, Madsen as Mr. Blonde, and Tarantino as Mr. Brown. We also have Tim Roth, I think I might have name-dropped him, who apparently refused to read for the film until he was well and drunk, as Mr. Orange, and Eddie Bunker, a former career criminal, how cool is that, rounding out the colors as Mr. Blue. Each of them, well, maybe not Mr. Brown and Mr. Blue, who are basically written off right away, even if we see Brown crash the car and die from his headshot wound. I think he must have gotten shot in the face. Each of them has their moment to shine in this film. Some of them have multiple moments to shine. For Tim Roth, even if I thought his reactions to getting shot came off as a little too childish or effeminate, he's got the great commode monologue. The sound design in that scene, by the way, the way the hand dryer is just cranked up to 11, brilliant. Just pure brilliance. Keitel and Buscemi nail every single scene, though shout out to Mr. Pink for being the only one to not draw their gun at the end, and instead he hides under the ramp and then GTFOs with the diamonds. Welcome back to that. And Madsen, Mr. Blonde, well, he gets the scene of the movie, doesn't he? In fact, I don't really think that Reservoir Dogs would work as well or even be highly regarded if it weren't for that scene. Of course, I am talking about the torture of police officer Marvin Nash, played by Kirk Baltz, which I think you can say really truly begins with that trunk shot we noted earlier. Fun fact, Madsen actually drove Baltz around in the trunk of his car, presumably in his Cadillac Coupe de Ville, which puts in an appearance here as Mr. Blonde's car due to those budget constraints. Believe it or not, Baltz was the one who suggested this just simply crazy idea so that he would know what it was like to be in the trunk. He wanted to understand his character a bit more. Unfortunately, Madsen drove him down an alley full of potholes and then through a Taco Bell drive-thru because he felt that it was important for his character to know what it was like to have a cop in the trunk of his car as he was just kind of running errands, which is what he basically does in the film, right? He goes and gets takeout. We'll come back to that. Tarantino's got another great quote here on this scene and why it works as well as it does and why it's presented the way it is, with the long, almost static shots or where it seems entirely handheld, really bringing the audience into the scene. I wanted it to be happening in real time, he said, with the audience being stuck there along with the characters, as the radio goes on all day playing hits from the 1970s. The sugary bubblegum rock songs take the edge of some scenes, but in that scene, the music actually makes it worse. It's the mixture of comedy and music and brutality that upsets people. Yes, it certainly did upset people, including Wes Craven, creator of A Nightmare on Elm Street, Scream, and just far, far more, who walked out of the theater during the scene when Reservoir Dogs screened at the Toronto International Film Festival. He later recalled, and I love this quote, "When I was out in the lobby, this kid came pounding out of the shadows and said, 'You're Wes Craven, right?' I said, 'Yeah.' And he said, 'And you're leaving because you can't take it?' I said, 'Yeah.' And he said, 'I just scared Wes Craven.'" Yeah, that kid was Quentin Tarantino. It was a nice, fun little memory. But also upset by this scene, Michael Madsen, who had some trouble filming it, especially after Baltz ad-libbed the line about having a little kid at home. Madsen had just had a kid of his own at the time, so it kind of really got to him. Also upset, Harvey Weinstein, head of Miramax, which distributed the film. You'd think, given the sordid history we now know about, and I think which was a pretty open secret at that time, he wouldn't really care much, but he felt this whole scene would have a negative effect on audiences and, the bottom line, his bottom line. Though he ultimately acquiesced to Tarantino. Like I said, I don't think the film would necessarily work without this scene, so good call. And ending the scene with Tim Roth shooting the crap out of Blonde, perfection. And so satisfying, even if it is a bit marred by a sloppy split focus shot afterwards. There's one other part of this film that I could really call perfect, and that's the soundtrack. I've sort of kind of talked about it already, noting the inclusion of Little Green Bag, but can you imagine the torture scene without Stuck in the Middle with You? I can't. Well, I don't know why I came here tonight. And apparently, Quentin Tarantino couldn't imagine it either, because the entire soundtrack budget was spent getting that song for this scene. The rest they only managed to afford through a record deal for the soundtrack, which dropped from MCA in October 92. Now, I've got the CD, and it's set up in a pretty cool way that I think kind of became a standard for film soundtracks at some point, where it includes not just the songs, but dialogue from the film as well. And even what I think is even cooler, it also includes Stephen Wright's DJ bits from the film, which I think are mostly omitted from the film. He comes in a few times. I love the way he says behemoth.
K. Billy's Super Sounds of the 70s continues, and if you're the 12th caller, you'll win 2 tickets to the Monster Truck Extravaganza being held tonight at the Carson Fairgrounds, featuring Big Daddy Don Bodine's truck, the Behemoth.
At least some of this, by the way, was written by Roger Avery. I thought he'd also done some cinematography on this film, but I couldn't find confirmation of that anywhere, so that could have just been some misinformation or maybe something lost in time. Anyway, the dialogue included, it sort of makes this CD, this album, the official recording of K. Billy's Super Sounds of the 70s weekend. By the way, I love the way K. Billy is incorporated into Reservoir Dogs. The way it's set up in the diner and just keeps coming up. K. Billy, of course, another holdover from My Best Friend's Birthday. I was talking about the cast at one point, wasn't I? I don't think I finished that, so right. Other than the core color wheel of characters that we have, we also get Chris Penn as Nice Guy Eddie, aka Mr. Track Jacket over there. Another byproduct of the budget, though Keitel wore his own suit, a specially made gift from French designer Agnes B. And man, did he make that look good or what? And finally, Lawrence Tierney as Joe Cabot, who's compared to Marvel's The Thing at one point. I just love that. And who has some of the best line delivery in the entire film, even if he couldn't remember them well enough to keep the gig. Tarantino actually fired him on the 3rd day of filming, though he took it back. There are a bunch of ancillary people as well. I mean, you can go read the full credits over on IMDb or just watch the film and look at the credits there. But more fun, I think, is the literal who's who of people who either auditioned for roles in this film or who Tarantino sought out for major roles within the film. Among them, James Woods, whose agent refused 5 different cash offers because they were apparently lower than his usual salary. James Woods got himself a new agent when he found that one out. Tarantino also offered Dennis Hopper and John Cryer the role of Mr. Pink. Hopper wasn't available, and Cryer said he simply didn't get the script. I wonder if it was handwritten. George Clooney, who'd of course appear in From Dusk Till Dawn, read for Mr. Blonde, as did Christopher Walken, who'd put show-stopping performances in both Pulp Fiction and True Romance. Samuel L. Jackson auditioned for the part of Mr. Orange. I like to think his gravitas was just kind of being retained for his now iconic role as Jules in Pulp Fiction, but yeah, he didn't get the part. And Robert Forster, who'd kill it in Jackie Brown, tried out for Joe. And that's just a couple of the names who cropped up. A few other notables that I saw mention of included David Duchovny, Viggo Mortensen, Matt Dillon, Nicolas Cage, and Ving Rames. Hold on to that last one for just a moment, because mentioning Kay Billy here along with all the reoccurring cast members, it's got me thinking. There are a lot of connections between Reservoir Dogs and Tarantino's future films, aren't there? One of the coolest to me is the name drop of Pam Grier. Of course, known for her blaxploitation film, she'd just embody the title role in Tarantino's 1997 Jackie Brown. We also got, of course, Joe asking about in Alabama, clearly the same Alabama that Patricia Arquette would play in True Romance, making this a sequel to that film. Well, if the ending hadn't been changed, of course. Joe also asks about a fence named Marcellus, possibly the same Marcellus Ving Rhames would give us in Pulp Fiction. See? Told you to hold on to that. Speaking of Pulp Fiction, though, Mr. White, whose real name is Larry Dimmock, shares his last name with Pulp's Jimmy Dimmock, portrayed by Tarantino, who's rather pivotal in that film. And Mr. Blonde, aka Vic Vega, his brother Vincent Vega, is played by John Travolta there. From what I gather, Michael Madsen was supposed to appear in Pulp Fiction, but didn't. So instead we got the Vega brothers. The Vega brothers were born. It's kind of neat. There was a whole plan at one point, or at least an idea, to have the two of them, Madsen and Travolta, team up for a film, a prequel film of sorts that would be based in Amsterdam, but it never went beyond just the idea, at least not yet. Vic, Mr. Blonde, of course, also mentions his parole officer is Seymour Scagnetti, a change from the script which has it as Craig Coons, but also possibly related to Jack Scagnetti from Natural Born Killers. And when Mr. Blonde makes his grand entrance, he's drinking out of a big Kahuna Burger cup. I told you we'd get back to that. Another Pulp Fiction standby. All these ties to Pulp Fiction. Well, it starts to make sense when you realize that Reservoir Dogs was originally part of Pulp Fiction, a Pulp Fiction that never was, part of the script that was then expanded into its own full-length feature film. But since they are two distinct films, we're left with an interesting question. Which of these two films, Tarantino's first two films, which takes place first? Which is the sequel and which the prequel? I've read a lot of interesting theories that say this one came first, or this one came first, or maybe they happened at the exact same time. But the theory that I'm going to stick to, because I really rather like it, comes from Reddit user SpaghettiOs, who supposes that both Tim Roth and Steve Buscemi played the exact same characters in both films. That Mr. Orange had once led a life of crime, well documented in Pulp Fiction, before seeking penance of sorts as a cop. And that Mr. Pink's minimum wage job he mentioned is as a waiter at Jack Rabbit Slim's, which you can actually hear mentioned in one of the Reservoir Dogs radio ads, where he got horrible tips and thus now doesn't believe in tipping. I like this idea. I love this theory, which is further backed up by an allusion to Joe in Pulp Fiction. Though I also kind of I hold out a little bit of hope that Pulp Fiction is a sequel to Reservoir Dogs, and that working as a waiter impersonating Buddy Holly is just Mr. Pink's inevitable and just fate. His penance, as it were. After all, we don't find out for sure what happened to him after he runs from the warehouse, do we? Though a 2006 video game adaptation, there was another video game adaptation in 2017. I just want to make a note of that, but we're not going to talk about that one because it wasn't good, and we're just going to skip it over. But that first one included an epilogue that gives us a fate, depending on how the player played the rest of the game. Mr. Pink either dies, gets arrested, or escapes. I mean, that's sort of the ongoing theme of the day, right? That and stealing, jewels, money, plot lines. At least it wasn't feet today. This has been the Drunk on Writing dissection of Quentin Tarantino's debut film, Reservoir Dogs. Remember, if you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to give it a thumbs up, leave a comment below, subscribe to the channel, do all of those little fun things, and you can follow me on social media if you really feel like it, and head on over to Drunk on Writing to sign up to get more episodes more often, and just help this channel grow, because it's cool. Yeah, I'm just going to say that. Until next time, and I am excited about next time. Cheers, and keep on writing.